Good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour à tous. Welcome to our discussion entitled FACETS at 10, What's Next for Interdisciplinary Research? Bienvenue à notre table ronde intitulée FACETS à 10 ans, quel avenir pour la recherche interdisciplinaire? This panel discussion is co-hosted by the Royal Society of Canada and Canadian Science Publishing. La discussion se déroulera en anglais, mais n'hésitez pas à poser vos questions dans l'une ou l'autre des langues officielles. Nous allons ouvrir la discussion après la présentation. I will now pass the floor to my colleague, Jules, for the land acknowledgement.
Canadian Science Publishing recognizes and respects the inherent and treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples across the lands known as Canada and worldwide, on whose territories we and our research contributors are privileged to live, work, and learn. We gratefully acknowledge the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, on whose unceded and unsurrendered territory our Ottawa head office is located, and we commit to dismantling structures in science publishing that have harmed Indigenous peoples, lands, and acknowledges, and to honoring the expertise of Indigenous knowledge keepers, past, present, and emerging, in pursuit of a just and sustainable future for all.
Thank you, Jules. Donc, mon nom est Fanie Pelletier. My name is Fanie Pelletier. I'm a professor in Université de Sherbrooke. I'm a CRC in biology. I also been a college member of the Royal Society since 2019, and I am one of the co-editor-in-chief of FACETS, the official journal of the Royal Society, the Academy of Science. Jules?
And I'm Jules Blais, a professor in biology and environmental science at the University of Ottawa, and I am founding editor-in-chief of FACETS.
Thank you. Donc, FACETS est la première et la seule revue scientifique multidisciplinaire en libre accès au Canada et elle bénéficie de l'appui de la Société royale du Canada, de l'Académie des sciences. La revue est publiée par Canadian Science Publishing, un organisme sans but lucratif qui possède plus de 96 ans d'expérience dans l'édition scientifique. En tant que revue ouverte et inclusive, FACETS vise à favoriser la diffusion des connaissances à travers les disciplines en rendant les résultats de la recherche accessibles à un large public, tant au sein de la communauté scientifique qu'au-delà. Elle offre une plateforme pour des travaux novateurs qui transcendent les frontières traditionnelles des domaines de recherche, contribuant ainsi à relever des enjeux complexes et interdisciplinaires.
So what is interdisciplinarity? Interdisciplinarity is the integration of multiple academic disciplines, methods, or schools of thought into a single activity or research project to address complex problems that exceed the scope of one field. It integrates perspectives from different areas such as sociology, biology, or economics to create a more comprehensive, innovative solution. And it may be directed to applied or fundamental questions. Whereas multidisciplinary approaches bring together multiple disciplines where researchers typically stay in their own lane, interdisciplinary research is an integration of multiple disciplines. We note here that FACETS is classified as a multidisciplinary journal, which is a category of academic publications recognized by major indexing systems like Web of Science or Scopus. Interdisciplinary research is not recognized as such because it is harder to define and classify, and it depends on the degree of integration.
Donc, en raison de sa portée en tant que revue multidisciplinaire, FACETS est particulièrement bien placée pour jouer un rôle clé dans la promotion de la recherche et de l'innovation interdisciplinaire. En rassemblant des travaux issus de divers domaines, la revue favorise les échanges entre les disciplines qui évoluent souvent en silos et encourage l'émergence de nouvelles collaborations et approches intégrées.
So we'd like to review here the format of our panel presentation. So we've asked our panelists to consider two questions. The first is, does interdisciplinarity add value to research? So for example, are there research questions that can only be answered or best be answered using interdisciplinary approaches? Or are there questions for which an interdisciplinary approach is more likely to yield deeper insights than disciplinary approaches? That's our first question. Our second question is, what can or should a journal like FACETS be doing to maximize the added value of interdisciplinary research? So we've asked each panelist to briefly introduce themselves and then to take about 5 minutes to answer our first question. We will then ask each of the panelists to do likewise. We'll go through all three panelists. After that, we will invite panelists to answer our second question. And then we will invite questions from the audience. Our panelists are Dr. Françoise Baylis, President of the Royal Society of Canada, Dr. David Castle, Board Chair at Canadian Science Publishing, and Dr. Scott Findlay, FACETS Consulting Editor and Researcher in Residence in the Office of the Chief Science Advisor. So we now invite our first speaker to begin. We will begin with Dr. Françoise Baylis.
Alors, bonjour tout le monde. Comme vous avez entendu, je suis la présidente de la Société royale du Canada et ma formation est en philosophie avec une spécialisation en bioéthique. So my training's in philosophy, that's my PhD, but I have from the very beginning had an official, it's on my degree, my transcripts, specialization in bioethics. And I mention that because what it means is that my training from the very beginning was interdisciplinary. I had to meet all of the standards of a PhD in philosophy. And in addition to that, I had to do an additional year working as an intern in a variety of clinical settings. And I think one of the things that has me committed to is interdisciplinarity, where you can meet the standards of a discipline and you actually have additional training so that you can understand the ways in which others think, write, act, research, so that together you can make important changes. So what I want to say at the beginning is I'm a strong proponent of interdisciplinary work and research, but grounded in disciplinary expertise.
And thank you very much. So that was the introduction. Would you like to go to the first question?
Oh, sure. I can take that on. So if we're thinking about what's the value add of interdisciplinary approaches, I would assert with a fair bit of confidence that it is an unassailable truth that there are unique benefits to interdisciplinary research. And I'm just going to give two quick examples, which do come from my disciplinary training in philosophy. And so in philosophy, many of us are committed to something that we refer to as the dialectical process. And what that means is that we believe knowledge production has to do with this tension between a thesis and an antithesis. And as we argue and explore those different perspectives, we hopefully move towards some kind of a synthesis. And then the process starts over and over again because we think we have a new piece of knowledge, it will be contested, and then we have that conversation, that research, etc., and out of that comes new knowledge. One of the things I think is really important in that description is it shows how knowledge production is iterative. And I think that's an important thing for us to hold on to and to think about, because that's not always widely understood by the general public with respect to science, right? So when science changes its mind about something, people are saying, oh, well, you must have told us something that was untrue before, or you're not reliable as a source of information. And I think that's a misunderstanding, and it's something we need to talk about as we keep talking about challenges right now for trust in science. So that's the first thing I'd want to say that's really important, is this kind of idea that that interdisciplinarity is what gives you a better conversation when you're thinking about that dialectical process, because people with different training are going to ask different questions of you. And so then you're going to have to try to engage and answer. And by that, I think your own work gets better and stronger. And the second point I'd like to make has to do with the fact-value distinction. My own training in philosophy is such that I don't actually believe in that distinction. And so when a person asserts a certain amount of facts, a person like me is going to try and unpack what are the values embedded in those factual claims. And if you think about it in the context of research, even the framing of your question speaks to what it is you think is important. Well, that's a value judgment to say, this is the important question that we need to study, explore, question. And so I think the things that become important for me really follow along those two axes. And I think one of the contemporary challenges for today is with the misinformation, the disinformation, the bad behavior in social media, we are losing some of the skills that we critically need for respectful engagement when there's difference. So that, again, I think speaks to one of the things that interdisciplinarity can do, bring together people with different training, different perspectives, a common goal of robust knowledge production.
Okay, thank you very much. if we can now move to our second speaker, Dr. David Castle. If you could begin by with an introduction and then proceed to our first question. Does interdisciplinarity add value to research?
Okay, thank you, and pleasure to be here today. So, David Castle, I'm a professor of public administration at the University of Victoria. Thematically, I work on science, technology, and innovation policy issues around open science, data governance, research security, and for about 25 years, I've kept my hand in working on issues arising around biodiversity science and global conservation efforts. Like my colleague Scott Findlay, I work in the Office of the Chief Science Advisor on those topics. And during my spare time, I do other things like Jules already mentioned, which is I chair the board of Canadian Science Publishing, and I suppose it's worth mentioning that we're publishing articles in FACETS as well, so that should not come as a surprise that my research group is also a contributor to the knowledge stock that's represented in the journal FACETS. By way of just a more extended biography here, I've worked at 4 different universities, and at every university, including while I was doing my PhD, I've worked in an interdisciplinary manner. My appointments have been originally between philosophy and molecular biology and genetics. Subsequently, it was between philosophy and common law at the University of Ottawa. Thereafter, at the University of Edinburgh, it was a combination of joint appointment between the College of Biological Sciences and the College of Social Sciences. And then when I returned back to Canada 12 years ago, I was cross-appointed between the Gustafson School of Business at the University of Victoria and the School of Public Administration. Largely, this has been thematically organized, interested in philosophy of science issues, eventually more science policy issues, intellectual property issues, and then also innovation systems issues. So the way that my appointments always got arranged was actually where I was working and the kinds of topics and questions that I had. So in this respect, my track record, if you look at my CV, reads very, very much interdisciplinary, and I have academic degrees in both molecular biology and chemistry. But like Françoise, my PhD ultimately was in an interdisciplinary field within philosophy, which was philosophy of science, specifically on philosophy of biology. So in this respect, I agree fully with Françoise that you do need to actually have some kind of disciplinary basis in order to do effective disciplinary work. And so a PhD in philosophy, I think, as it turns out, is an excellent avenue into other areas of academic inquiry. And so I think we're probably very closely aligned on that point. From my perspective, to just go to the first question, I think that there is a tremendous value add with interdisciplinary work. And the way I tend to think about this is in a kind of, I guess just shows my own personal training in analytic philosophy. I just want to start with definitions of things before we get to analysis and thinking through things. I think that if you have a research question, you can always actually have multiple disciplines inquiring after that particular research question. Like you could ask a question like, what's the relationship between a country's economic productivity and citizen happiness, for example, just some random question like that. And the economists can have a go at it, and social scientists can have a go at it. People who measure happiness and so on and so forth as part of, individual and group psychology could have a go at it. So you can always take a research question and have different disciplines want to actually take a stab at answering the question. But I think interdisciplinarity, from its very starting point, comes with a different kind of epistemic commitment to the view that once you actually start to align different disciplinary methodologies and train them on a specific research question where you're trying to actually get some sort of synthetic cross-fertilization of how the research questions are organized and planned out, perhaps temporally, but at least logically, you end up with something quite magical, which is a deepening of understanding that is epistemically boundary spanning in the way that you just don't get with multidisciplinary approaches. So I think that's kind of a fancy way of saying that there's a lot of epistemic value add. We just end up learning more. And I think we end up learning more in much more nuanced ways because of the interactions of disciplinary perspectives, which come with their own methods and methodological commitments, which in turn show that there actually are some conceptual foundations and frameworks at play there, which I think Françoise was also alluding to, that if you come to the table with facts and values, and the more you disclose about your commitment to particular facts, you also disclose things about the way that you organize knowledge and what you value in it. And I would say the last thing about this is that that's great for interdisciplinarity, and I've been a happy participant in it for going on now for almost three decades. But I think there's one other thing that can be said about value add with interdisciplinarity, which is that I think it stands as a potential practice gateway for actually getting towards something more fundamentally profound but much rarer, which is some kinds of transdisciplinary synthesis where you realize that the alignment of research methods and methodological commitments to answering research questions comes to a natural limit where you actually have to just completely think differently. And I think there are instances in which we've actually we've come to the point at which you realize that even interdisciplinarity can run its course, but it's been on the right path all the way along to some sort of new kind of conceptual breakthrough. And I think that there are cases where this has actually happened. I guess the one that comes to mind to me frequently is thinking about Elinor Ostrom and the whole work around institutional analysis and design, which was not just a mere synthesis of antecedent approaches. It became a whole different thing itself to understanding how value is generated within collectives and transmitted beyond those collectives to society at large. And it was a whole way of organizing the not only the research methods, but the new methodological commitments that had to be developed to answer this question more fully actually reshaped the fundamental research questions in ways that we didn't quite see before. And I guess that's worthy of a Nobel Prize, which laterally speaks to, I think, to the fact that I think that some of these new conceptual frameworks that you can get with transdisciplinary research is kind of like I don't think it should be the end goal of doing interdisciplinary work, but I think that when we're talking about value add, I think that interdisciplinarity actually opens up gateways for that kind of transformational epistemic undertaking. So I think I'll stop there, and we can move on to Scott when you're ready, Jules.
Thank you. Yeah, Dr. Findlay, can you begin with an introduction and then proceed to the first question?
Sure. Thanks, Jules, and thanks everybody for participating in this. So I'm Scott Findlay. I was a professor of biology at the University of Ottawa for 35 years, and as David said, more recently I've been a researcher in residence at the Office of the Chief Science Advisor. And when I was at the university, I directed or was the associate director of two nominally interdisciplinary institutes. I think I developed 3 or 4 interdisciplinary graduate programs and an equal number of undergraduate programs. And at the Office of the Chief Science Advisor, I've had a lot of, as David already alluded to, I've had a lot of experience some experience in the interdisciplinary context. And so I wanted to say that my thoughts on interdisciplinarity, such as they are colored very much by those two very different sets of experiences. And so there's probably a high degree of idiosyncrasy. So people shouldn't take this as any way shape, or form necessarily generalizable. So the first point I wanted to make is for me, there's a distinction between the value add of interdisciplinary in what would usually be called applied research versus fundamental research. In my personal experience, in the context of applied research, we're seeking solutions to problems or ways and means by which we can capitalize on opportunities. And in every case of where I've been personally involved, the kinds of effects of different solutions, the implementation of those, there are a wide range of possible effects. So if you think about the problem of the spread of a disease, and you have a public health measure that's being implemented, that public health measure may have effects on the spread of the disease, i.e. epidemiological effects. It may have economic effects. It may have human rights effects. It may have public health effects. It may have mental health effects. And if all of these effects were kind of pairwise independent, then multidisciplinarity would be sufficient to answer the question, what is the constellation of effects and what's the best solution? However, that is almost never the case in my experience. These effects have indirect effects on one another. They're correlated effects, and often they're first and second order rather than zeroth order effects. And so the value of interdisciplinarity is in trying to characterize that network of effects. And I'm speaking in the applied context here. And again, I reiterate, this is from my personal experience, so it may not be generalizable. When we talk about fundamental research, again, my personal experience is the value add of interdisciplinary is twofold. The first one has to do with what I would characterize as general patterns. So we see the same sorts of empirical patterns that occur in a wide range of disciplines. I'm thinking, for example, of scaling law relationships or fractal patterns. These appear in all sorts of different contexts. So it's kind of the characterization of these patterns that appear time and time and time again in many, many different contexts. The other element that in fundamental research is the process. So you have, when you start to articulate differences amongst disciplines in their mode of methodological inquiry, my experience has been is that the processes or the methods that have been used in one discipline can be imported into another one and provide considerably greater insight. In my own personal experience, the importation has come from the various fields of mathematics, in particular, the theory of games, the theory of graphs, and the theory of deterministic chaos. All of these are developments in the area of mathematics that have yielded tremendous insights in very different fields of inquiry. So I would say that the two value adds of interdisciplinary research are in understanding the whole panoply of effects that are associated with things that people might do, interventions that we might make, especially, as David knows, policy types of interventions. And secondly, deeper insights into the nature of natural processes by bringing in different methodological tools or approaches from other disciplines. And again, caveat emptor, this is based on my own personal experience. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Scott. So that's very interesting, and it sounds like we have consensus on the value of interdisciplinarity in research. If we could move now to our second question, which particularly is of interest to us at FACETS, which is what can and should a journal like FACETS be doing to maximize the added value of interdisciplinary research? And we can proceed to Dr. Françoise Baylis, please.
Great. So I have a couple of things that are sort of generic that I put out there for people to think about. But I think the long-term goal should really be to transform the research culture. And I think one does that in a number of different arenas. And so I can think about changes perhaps in what we might think of as the intellectual space in which people are working, but also the interpersonal space for knowledge production. And I would say, last of all, what happens within our institutions. And so I'm thinking that what becomes really important if we're thinking about a change in research culture, because of the way I think and work, I almost want to take us back to a space that people might not be very comfortable in thinking or talking about, but that really has to do with virtues and character traits. And how is it that we foster, support, build up esteem, trust, and respect across the disciplines? So for someone who's been doing this for a very long time, first of all, when it wasn't popular and wasn't even understood, and then when it became popular, but it was kind of window dressing. I can't tell you the number of grants where the grant's about to go in, and 2 days before I get asked if somebody can have my CV, to add to their grant so that they can say legitimately, oh yes, we're interdisciplinary. Look at this, we've got a philosopher. That doesn't bode well for meaningful interactions. It doesn't bode well for interactions that would be either intellectually engaging or interpersonally rewarding. They do serve institutional goals if you're successful in getting the grants and you can, say something about that. And then, of course, if you do get publications out of that, it looks perhaps good on paper. But I don't think that that's the way in which you change culture. And I think that's what we need. I mean, if our answers to the first question is that there is really a clear understanding of the value of talking across disciplines, and an understanding that in some places those have become unnecessary and, quite frankly, unhelpful silos, then what we're really talking about is cultural transformation. And if I think about some of the comments that David made along the way, he introduced the term, transdisciplinary. And that, to me, is really what you get when you change culture. So if you think about it, in the early days, it's multidisciplinary, multiple disciplines, but you could be working side by side the way kids work with toys side by side, and it's all pleasant, but we're really still doing our own thing. And then you get to this kind of space that we're in now, where we think we're comfortable with the notion of interdisciplinarity, where you have multiple disciplines, and we're trying genuinely to work across those disciplines. But when you get to this transdisciplinary space, I think you're really trying to look for new processes, new ways of thinking, new ways of collaborating. And in this space, I often, in my research teams, would offer up the notion of collaborative ambition. What does it mean to collaborate, understanding that there are still, in some way, shape, or form, different ways in which we understand the world and different ways in which we understand the kinds of contributions that we can make? I think I want to just offer up, a couple of personal examples, because they may be useful for conversation later. For me, you have reached multidisciplinary productive environments when people can actually have an impact on the ways in which somebody with different disciplinary training thinks, acts, and is willing to shift their research agenda. And I can give you a very simple example in my own career. Early on, working with a team of geneticists who were at the frontier and looking to do work involving and manipulating human embryos. This was very controversial in the late 80s, early 90s, still controversial today, but perhaps a little bit less so. And having been brought in early, so prior to the funding, prior to that, to actually be able to have an impact on the trial design and have an impact on the way in which the basic science was going to take place. And so, when the scientists explained to me what they were going to do, I said, well, why are you starting with human embryos? You can actually do a lot of this training on mice embryos. Like, I know they're a different size, I know the science is different, but you can actually learn a lot in terms of, manipulating your micropipettes, et cetera. And you will then be able to show yourself as responsible insofar as you've paid attention to the views and values of others that may not share yours. If and when you move to actually manipulating human embryos, we can draw a distinction between viable and non-viable embryos. So why don't you start with non-viable embryos? And the conversation was such that over time, the trial design gets changed, the research gets changed, because there's enough respect that you're having open conversations about what the science should look like, with the same goal of trying to get to knowledge around something that you deem to be an important question. So I guess what I want to say by way of closing is that what this should ultimately be about, and what I think FACETS should be trying to support, is a change in culture. And there are very concrete things. You can look, for example, at the differences between the disciplines at something so simple as authorship, and who gets to be first author and who gets to be last author. That all changes by discipline. What would it mean to break that down and to not have people guessing about who's going to be the first author or the last author because of what it means within their discipline? As somebody who's worked in that interdisciplinary space, it's amazing how much time gets taken up with that conversation. But, those are the things that have to happen. I think beyond that, the only other sort of concrete thing I would say is, if we're really going to be doing something that involves a change in culture, we need, whether we're thinking basic science or applied science, we need to be thinking about the policy implications of our work. People do science and people are excited about knowledge production because they want to make the world a better place. And we need to make sure that we do that. And again, I would say we've done a lot that's on paper, right? There isn't a grant application these days where you don't have to talk about your translational commitments. I don't think we're there yet in any way, shape, or form. And so that, I think, is, again, something the journal could commit to interrogate. How do you move from just generating all this knowledge to moving it into another arena? And I mean, there are people here, myself included, who work at that, but there are still challenges. Why? Because in the political arena, it's not just the science and evidence that moves the question. So we need to be sure it's there, and we need to make sure it's there in a way that's effective for consumption by those who have power and decision making.
Thank you very much. Dr. Castle, if we can proceed to you, what should a journal like FACETS be doing to maximize the added value of interdisciplinary research?
Okay, let me just preface this what I'll say by just making it clear that I'm not responding to this question as the board chair for Canadian Science Publishing. I mean, as board chair, I'm responsible for assisting the executive of the CSP to carry out its functions effectively and achieve a very high level of integrity in its governance. And that's a role that does not include telling journal editors what and how to do their work. So CSP has an editor-in-chief for that sort of function to aid in those kinds of conversations. So just to make this completely clear, I'm just speaking as somebody who's done this as a researcher over many decades, and my reflections then on how FACETS could actually capture that value add and maybe mobilize that kind of knowledge. So Françoise actually alluded to this about coming in late on grant applications or coming in late on academic publications as a researcher of a different stripe, where you're thought to be by virtue of just simply being included in the list of applicants to a grant or authorship on a paper, that you've somehow achieved a semblance of interdisciplinarity. And certainly in the context of applied ethics, where you don't have the kinds of experience, for example, that Françoise described, where you're kind of at the ground floor of thinking through experimental design and research questions and actually contributing to that kind of intellectual content. If you're not doing that and you're only coming in very laterally, it's often extremely difficult to actually make any sort of unique or significant intellectual contribution. Nevertheless, it happens. And it happens so much in the context of applied ethics that I somewhat frustratedly used to just say, well, you can't just sort of add ethics and stir and then call it an applied ethics or a bioethics or an environmental ethics kind of proposal or publication, because some of these things just don't mix at the very end, and you have to do the interdisciplinary work to lay claim to the fact that you've actually done something meaningful, and you've generated new knowledge. Now, my perspective as somebody who reviews a lot of operating grants, but also a lot of infrastructure grants, I think I've developed a pretty high sensitivity to the fact that many teams offer themselves up as being interdisciplinary, but you don't oftentimes actually see what the real intellectual contact points are between the researchers in what they're proposing to do or what they're published claiming having done something interdisciplinary. And I think that's, if I were to say anything about what FACETS can do to actually make sure that the value of interdisciplinary work is captured effectively, is to make sure that there's a very high sensitivity bias towards making sure that interdisciplinarity is not offered in name only as the kind of just add ethics and stir kind of version, but that there are actually some general criteria or guidelines there that are constantly revisited and applied to manuscripts that are submitted to FACETS, but also internally to the editorial process, that the sensitivity is turned up very high to make sure that nothing ends up in a journal that is saying in effect that its brand is to extend scholarly knowledge, where the commitment is to multi and interdisciplinarity, that commitment is actually realized in the work. So I think that is something I think that FACETS just needs to continue to work on, and to actually test authors if there's any doubt about whether or not the work was in fact interdisciplinary. And that can just be, going back to authors or having more significant sort of preemptive screening processes to make sure that the work is indeed reaching the multi and interdisciplinary objectives of the journal. Because I think that what's at stake here is the on the plus side, you can have extremely interesting work if you're focused on actually making sure that they meet, contributions meet some kind of test of interdisciplinarity. And on the other end of the spectrum, you can end up with publications that sort of signal having done the interdisciplinary work, which is, frankly, I think oftentimes very difficult work to do, but doesn't actually deliver in the end. And I worry that because there are both within universities and funding bodies and so forth, a lot of pressure for people who do interdisciplinary work to prove their mettle and to show that this is still to this day that interdisciplinary activity is as worthy as discipline-based scholarship, that we need to make sure that we safeguard the intellectual contributions of interdisciplinarity and don't let it get diluted by having peer-reviewed academic publications coming out where it exposes or leads to questions about whether or not this interdisciplinary work is any good, when in fact the case might not be made about interdisciplinarity. It just might not have been reflected adequately in a journal article, or there may be false claim laid to having done interdisciplinary work. So I guess to summarize, I think that FACETS is it's a very interesting journal to read and to contribute to. I do believe that it has an excellent brand, but I think that brand is definitely predicated on capturing authentic and very high quality interdisciplinary work. And that just means that the editorial stance of the journal needs to pursue that as basically a promise, kind of a brand promise, that it will deliver to the academic and policy communities that read FACETS. That's my take on it.
Thank you very much. And finally, Dr. Findlay, if you could, our last question is, what should a journal like FACETS be doing to maximize the added value of interdisciplinary research?
So my response to that, Jules, is going to take off from my response to the first question. And just to refresh everybody's memory, my view was that in the context of applied research, the value of interdisciplinarity is identifying the network of relationships amongst different effects of possible solutions to a problem. And in the context in fundamental research, it's really about the characterization of patterns or processes that occur in a wide range of contexts. And that gives rise to some very interesting questions about why that's the case. So really the value of interdisciplinary is different in those two contexts, at least for me, from my experience. And so what I would say is that FACETS as a journal, if I were to give my advice, it would be that it actually becomes proactive in two senses. It becomes proactive in the sense of identifying the problems or issues for which the characterization of the network of effects or issues associated with it is paramount to an effective and efficient solution to the problem. And in the context of fundamental research, it's the characterization of those universal patterns or processes and the types of questions and hypotheses that universality gives rise to. So in my conception, both of those are really kinds of missions. And so I would see, an interesting role for FACETS being the characterization of these missions. This is very proactive. I'm not talking about the kind of approach, they're not mutually exclusive, of course, but, kind of a gatekeeping reactive approach. I would be far more enthusiastic about a much more proactive approach where FACETS engages with its readership to identify these missions, either in the applied setting or in the fundamental research setting. And that could be an activity that engages the broad FACETS readership and others. I particularly liked Françoise' comment, and now I'm showing my bias, having been 8 years at the Office of the Chief Science Advisor of Canada, in at least with respect to that first set of missions, that is in the applied research domain, a critical, absolutely critical element of the network of connections and effects is the political dimension. It's, as Françoise and others on this call know very, very well, in the final analysis, that is hugely, hugely important. So the characterization of those missions is in part a political characterization. So to summarize, and I'm probably being a bit abstruse here, but I think FACETS should be in the mission characterization business.
Right. Thank you very much. So we can now move to some questions that we are receiving from the audience. I have here, is the value interdisciplinary or relational, i.e. individual attitudes, openness, honesty, good heart, and communication? So this is an interesting question about, is the value about the interdisciplinarity, or is it more of a relational issue? And could we put this question to Dr. Baylis? Would you be willing to?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. I actually think that it's both, and I don't think they're separable. I'm saying that on the basis of my own work experience. If I go into a team and they actually honestly think I have something to contribute, they're anxious to hear what I have to contribute. Doesn't mean they're going to agree with me, but they want to know, what does somebody with my kind of training do? In French, we talk about it as une formation. Formation, you're being shaped, right? So they want to know, how does somebody with my kind of shaping of my way of thinking respond to the ideas that they have? And when I go into a team like that, it's fantastic, because we're both there to learn from each other with the view that together we can do something spectacular. If I feel like I've been brought in at the last minute just to, rubber stamp something, from the get-go, I feel like we don't really have any relationship. You don't really care about what I might genuinely think. And it's this sort of sense that I'm just window dressing. And I don't think anybody really, if you have your own training and thoughts and consider yourself a person with knowledge to contribute, that's just not a fun space to be in. But I think that it's not just friendship, and it's not just, oh, these are nice people to sit around and talk with, and these are people, that I can interact with. It's that there's something that you're putting on the table that wouldn't have occurred to them but for. In some of my work, I talk about the value of slow science. And, in the context of the pandemic, I can't tell you how many people came back to me and said, aha, Françoise, you see, you and your slow science, that's not what we needed at all. How did we get success, right? And that gave me an opportunity to say, we didn't understand slow science. Slow science isn't about going slow for the sake of going slow. Slow science is giving yourself space to get the right question, the right research question, so that when you go forward with the research, you're likely to generate knowledge that's usable in a shorter time frame. And so that would be a way of sort of having just some interesting intellectual conversations about what's the concept of slow science, how does it work, why should somebody doing basic science care about slow science? Get the question right the first time, rather than sort of taking off in a hurry because you've got to meet so many metrics in terms of publications, grants, patents, what have you. And so that's an invitation for me to think about the culture within which science is working now and how that's changed. And if I can, I will just add on, if you really are going to be proactive and look towards the commitment to make change in terms of the culture of research and the capacity to have an impact in terms of policy, you are going to need friends. You can't do this going into the room and not trusting each other. So for me, the answer is they are so intertwined, and you actually need both. You need nice interpersonal skills so that you can actually see the benefit that somebody with different disciplinary training can contribute. And it's a two-way street. We're both there to learn.
Thank you very much. We have another question here that speaks to policy. So perhaps this could be directed to Scott, who talked about the political aspects. I would like to add that when we talk about doing research that can be applied in the policy landscape, interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity must include policymakers in the early stages, just like in the example Françoise offered about including herself early on. Speaking with policymakers, project managers, etc., in the early stages greatly improves the likelihood of the work being utilized and contributing to culture change. Is this something that academic institutions and publishers can directly support?
Well, first of all, I would agree wholeheartedly with the claim that getting the policy folks involved on the ground floor, it's the same as getting the bioethicists involved on the ground floor. This is an important part of absolutely an important part of the enterprise. I think that, is something like FACETS able to do something like this? Jules, you and I have had this discussion for years in the context of FACETS about trying to get policy relevant research and inquiry as part of the offerings that FACETS provides to its readership. And, you and I have discussed on a number of occasions the possibility, and this goes back to my idea of missions. You could think of policy missions, right? Missions that are specifically designed to inform big policy questions that Canadians, the federal government in Canada or people globally are confronting. And to my mind, a policy-based set of policy-based missions would be fantastic.
I have a question here regarding the potential role of artificial intelligence in promoting interdisciplinary research. So what do you see as, one of the challenges with and one of the limitations with research has been that people tend to stay in their own lanes. Researchers tend to be comfortable in their formal training, but these interdisciplinary perspectives are harder to define, and people are less comfortable working in places where they're not as well trained. And so, do you see opportunities or risks associated with the potential use of artificial intelligence in promoting interdisciplinary approaches?
I'll take a crack at that and see where we get to with that. One of the things that let's actually be clear too. I mean, artificial intelligence is a suite of disparate tools of, everything from machine learning, onward. One specific branch of all of that, of course, are the large language models, which everybody now conflates with AI unhelpfully, in my opinion. But within the use of LLMs, so long as you're a good query writer, you can actually tap into written material at a speed and sometimes with a level of precision that is actually quite astounding. And you end up with assemblies of text, which, if you can interpret them, can actually be quite useful. The challenge, of course, is that it may not always be interpretable by the end user. And I would go back to something that Françoise said in her opening remarks, which is that one of the key benefits of interdisciplinary activity is that it actually does have a kind of dialogical, if not dialectical, dimension to it, which is difficult to replace with LLMs, which are essentially just repackaging existing text without interpreting it for you. What happens when you actually engage with people is that you end up with certain kinds of nuance around inquisition, interrogation of a particular kind of subject that machines don't quite do for you. And I think that there's no substitute. So this is where I think there's a pitfall of LLMs, is that there's no substitute in my mind for the live interaction between researchers who are engaged in that kind of collaborative ambition, where you actually do have mutualized learning. I think that's one of the most fantastic things about doing interdisciplinary work, is that, and maybe this is actually down to personality. I don't know if it's a virtue, but certainly down to personality, is that I much rather learn about other people's perspectives on a research question than I would rather just simply use a standard set of discipline-based methods and tools to crank out regular answers to specific research questions. Because I find that when you engage with people and you have this mutualized learning, it can lead you to reframing your own understandings of the research questions that you had in mind to begin with. And I think that that's actually can be quite intellectually transformative, and especially as you do it over time, you end up accumulating the experience of actually having had your own thinking about something reshaped so many times that you become quite used to that feeling and start to seek it out. And I don't think you get that sort of thing from LLMs. So I think that those are, LLMs are interesting tools, but they have their own limitations, and so I think that people should be not falling into a thought pattern of that there are black and white trade-offs between using or not using them. But like anything, it's good to sort of balance out utilization of something like LLMs with actual live engagement of people in discourse that can lead you to, I think, greater heights of understanding and some new vistas along the way.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So we have come to the end of our hour. I would like to thank our speakers for this very interesting discussion. Thank you very much for giving us your time and your thoughts on this. And that concludes our panel discussion. Thank you so much.
Merci beaucoup.
Thanks, everybody. Great discussion.